Well, this afternoon and evening, we're going to talk a little bit about infectious disease. And this is a topic that should be important to everybody, really in the world. And we're going to do that through a vehicle of something that happened to us, my wife and I, when we were stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And that was the first outbreak of Ebola here in the United States. And so with that, we will go forward. So it's hard to believe that in 1968, the Surgeon General of the United States, our chief medical officer in our country, actually said at a large meeting, "It's time to close the book on infectious diseases. We've won." Well, in retrospect, that sounds pretty silly. But why in 1968 would he say something like that to an audience who was very knowledgeable about this? In 1968, we had antimicrobials and vaccines that were working very, very well to help protect our health. We had hygiene and nutrition, so we were expanding our life expectancies. We had vectors were understood, and the life cycles have been elucidated. We were using DDT to help control mosquitoes and some of the most important vectors. The agricultural diseases largely controlled, so we had plenty to eat, and we could certainly feed our populations in a very significant way. And the historic killers had been largely eradicated or controlled, things like polio, tuberculosis, TB. There's a picture of a polio ward up here. There are probably a lot of people in here who have no idea what that is. Very significant diseases. And in 1968, the Biowarfare Convention, the BWC, ratification was imminent, and that's the international treaty that made it illegal to use biologic weapons on the battlefield or as weapons of war. So we can't talk about what happened at the Ebola outbreak without talking about USAMRIID. And USAMRIID is the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. And it is the Army's primary job there to protect soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on the battlefield from biologic agents. And because at this time it was only one of two places in the entire United States that had significant biocontainment capabilities, it's one of the places that would work on high hazard pathogens, the most dangerous of the dangerous. So we had very specialized facilities, and I could give you an hour-long talk just talking about this. But this is really at the heart of it, and what you're looking at here is a picture of a couple guys in what we call the blue suits or the spacesuits, and these are positive pressure suits that allow you to work in a very high hazard environment with the worst of the biologic agents in relative safety. I say relative, but clearly, that technology has been proven. So when we think about the occupational health, the occupational medicine side of working in a place like USAMRIID, this is one of the things that was interesting as far as what happened to us at Reston. This is called the Air Medical Isolation Team, and what you're looking at there is a biosafety level 4 capable stretcher that was designed to go outside of the United States or someplace within the United States and retrieve somebody who had been infected with one of these very dangerous pathogens. Obviously, you're pretty sick if they send an airplane with this thing to come get you. But this technology that these folks had, the way they had developed some of the equipment, was very useful to us when we had this very unexpected outbreak of Ebola in the United States. We did not have, we being USAMRIID, we did not have a deployment capability. That wasn't part of our mission. It was a laboratory operation. And so one of the things that stretcher allowed you to do was to take somebody into an occupational medicine room that was called the slammer. And we called it the slammer, and if you got to visit the slammer, that wasn't a very entertaining visit. So this little cartoon you're looking at says, "Please don't be alarmed, Mr. Parker." But those preliminary results indicate the advisability of a few precautions. So if you're unfortunate enough to get into the slammer, that's exactly what the people who would take care of you would look like. They would be wearing these sorts of suits. Now, Nancy and I worked there for a long time, and after much consideration, we decided that if you wake up some morning and these guys are taking your temperature, dressed up in these suits, that's probably bad. And I can for certain tell you that if these doggy doctors are looking at you in these suits, that's really bad. But all joking aside, it's serious business. This is a biosafety level 4 capable morgue. Not used much, but certainly that capability is important if you're working with the kind of organisms that are part of the deal there. So we'll talk about what happened at Reston. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it's completely different than it is now these days. At that time, Well, you know, I can't read this. It was a dark time in the world of infectious disease research. Grievous national miscalculations, this goes back to Surgeon General Stewart, about the threat of biowarfare, bioterrorism, and emerging infectious diseases had gutted the U.S. research capability because we'd won, and we funneled money elsewhere. And emergency plan and response capability were really non-existent. And when we had this outbreak, we really had to decide how to do that on the fly. So here's how it started out. There were some non-human primate tissues that were sent to the pathology division at USAMRIID, which is the division that Nancy was the chief of. And it was from a group of monkeys that had been imported in the United States, and obviously they were sick. These are lungs, and you can see the hemorrhages associated with that. Well, this is the presumptive diagnosis was that these animals were suffering from simian hemorrhagic fever, which is a very significant hemorrhagic fever for monkeys, but is not zoonotic, and so it doesn't affect humans. So there were some diagnostics done, and guess what? It popped up that there was a filovirus discovered, and what you're looking at there is a slice of lung, an electron microscopic slide, and it had a filovirus in it. The presumptive diagnosis was that it was Marburg. Well, Marburg was a very serious filovirus that had killed 25% of laboratory workers in Germany in 1967 that had imported monkeys and used them in polio vaccine studies. So, very, very dangerous disease, and really ramped up our concern. But emergency diagnostics were done, emergency additional diagnostics, and lo and behold, it wasn't Marburg, it was Ebola. So Ebola, the outbreaks of Ebola, now we're talking about a disease that has 90% mortality and had never been seen outside of Africa before, and not in animals, in any kind of animals. So it was a complete surprise. And I think, as Nancy would say, this ramped up the pucker factor in a huge way for us within the infectious disease research community, and certainly within USAMRIID. So here was the situation we found ourselves in. We had Ebola infected had been confirmed in a non-human primate quarantine facility in Reston, Virginia. And for those of you who are familiar with the greater DC area, this is essentially a part of the DC greater metroplex. There were about 450 cynomolgus monkeys that were in this facility. The presumption was that all of them would be infected eventually. And there certainly was potential for human exposures because people were working there, obviously. And so we did what all really good bureaucrats do. When that diagnosis came in, we had a big meeting. And that meeting involved people from the DOD and the CDC and the World Health Organization and many health departments and people from all over the place, and tried to figure out what we were going to do. And so essentially what happened is, because we had the most experience in the country dealing with high hazard animal work, these pathogens, the task to go down and really manage this outbreak fell to us at USAMRIID. Now, one of the reasons that this is, we're still talking about it 25 years later is because there was a book written about this. And Richard Preston wrote a book called The Hot Zone. And it was the New York Times bestseller for well over a year. And it turned out, I saw in the paper one day, that it was the 40th best-selling book of the entire decade of the 90s. Now, that's pretty good for a nonfiction book about an outbreak of Ebola and about Ebola fever. But what I want to talk about is the realities of response. And one of the reasons I mentioned the hot zone is because of all the interest associated with these issues. So in the Reston Ebola incident, I could tell you about all the things we did right. And in fact, we have, especially post-infection workout, we talked at all of the major government and health issues, talking about how we managed this particular outbreak. So I could tell you all about that, but it's more fun to talk about the stuff that went wrong. So Murphy's Law raised its head, certainly, and the kinds of things that we had to deal with. For those of you who have ever been on the Leesburg Pike, it's horrible. The traffic is bad. It turned out, just by luck of the draw, that we were about 50 miles from this place, so we were able to drive back and forth. There was a daycare center, believe it or not, that was about 50 yards from this facility. And obviously, having an Ebola outbreak, now, you know, in 1989, there wasn't one person in 1,000 that ever heard the word Ebola. Because, you know, unless you lived in Zaire, you probably would have never heard about it. So we had this daycare center that we had to deal with. And when I say we, I'm talking about our public health people. We had an HVAC malfunction, and that's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And so the second day we were there, the ambient temperature in the facility went up into the upper 90s. We were wearing these spacesuits, and of course they're not air conditioned, they're just air filtered. Very, very significant safety issues for our people that participated. But the thing that really turned this from what we thought was going to be about a 3 or 4 day deal into a full week was the fact that some of the animals weren't in squeeze cages. Now, squeeze cage is a device for a monkey cage that has a false back, and you flip a couple switches and you can bring the animal to the front, and we have some very efficacious anesthetic agents that you can inject into their thigh. And so within a couple of minutes, you can handle one of these animals very, very carefully. Well, if you don't have a squeeze cage, you don't have a whole lot of, you don't have a whole lot of options except reaching in with a big glove and grabbing these monkeys. Now, I've caught a lot of monkeys that way. I don't ever like to do it under any circumstances. But if they have Ebola, you really don't want to reach in and grab them. So we had to come up with some very significant high-tech sort of way to deal with this, and this was our strategy. So the guy on your right has a mop handle, and what we did is we wrapped that with a towel and then put tape around it, and so it was sort of U-shaped, and you would try to pin the animal into the back of the cage. And you can see these cages. You'd have to get on your hands and knees on the lower ones, and you have to stand on a ladder on the upper ones. Try to pin the monkey, and then the guy on your left, he has a pole syringe, which is about a 4-foot pole that has a needle on the end of it with anesthetic, and then you try to anesthetize the monkey. Well, long story short, very, very difficult to do. Some of the cages had 2 monkeys in them, which complicated things considerably. And of course, we were very concerned about safety, and the biggest thing we were worried about is that we'd have a monkey get loose. Sure enough, Murphy's Law raised its head, and we had a monkey get loose in one of these animal rooms. So, after Richard Preston wrote his book, there was a movie made about this, loosely based on this event, loosely. So, in that movie, they had an outbreak of a hemorrhagic fever from Africa, thinly veiled as Ebola, and it was killing very significant numbers of people on the West Coast. So they finally figured out that it was probably a monkey that was carrying this disease. And so they went on TV, one of the heroes, and he says, "Anybody seen the monkey?" Well, sure enough, there was a lady who'd been cleaning her daughter's room that morning, had seen a little picture she'd drawn, and he said, "You know what? I think that looks like the monkey. I think she saw the monkey." She calls the guys up and said, "I think my daughter must have seen the monkey." So they flew up in the helicopter, they went out on her back deck, they threw a couple apples on the deck and hid in the bushes. Sure enough, out of this redwood forest comes this monkey, starts eating the apples. They shoot it with a capture gun, jump in the helicopter, fly back to where all the people are dying. They take this little monkey that's about the size of a Scotty, and they take enough immune sera to fill several tanker trucks full of immune sera. And they treat everybody at the place, and they save the world. So, here's the real, that's the Hollywood army. Here's the real army. We had a monkey get loose in a room that was about 30 feet long and about 15 feet wide, and me and 2 of my guys chased this monkey all day long for an entire day. Never had a chance to get away. He was, he was scared of us, as he probably should have been, and we weren't scared, but we were concerned about him. And so that, my friends, is the reality of response. The Hollywood version is what our people want. That's what they expect of the government. That's what they expect of our research folks. But unfortunately, this fiasco we had is much more realistic. So this is a picture that I took in the facility, and the 3 guys you sort of see up the center, those are Army Veterinary Corps officers. And I want you to take a look at the people on the sides, because these are Army enlisted animal technicians. And our military is full of people that you should be proud of. And when you see them, you ought to say hi to them and give them a pat on the back. They don't pay those enlisted people hardly anything. And so I think it's important to appreciate what they do for you. Well, the thing about resting Ebola, it turned out that nobody got sick. We thought we were dealing with Ebola Zaire the entire time. What we found out, though, after the event was over, that the 5 people who worked in this facility, the people that worked for this contractor, that 4 out of those 5 became infected with Ebola. So had this been Ebola Zaire, had this been the disease that killed 9 out of 10 people, those people would have probably been dead, and many of their friends. What about our people? We had 42 people that were part of the deal, and not one person got sick. So all the things that we did were right, and I think that translates to what I hope to touch on, which is what happened in West Africa this year. So what did we learn at Reston? We learned that emergency planning, teamwork, and leadership works. We learned that the right PPE works. That's protective equipment. We know that it works because of what happened there. And we know that leadership works. Well, what did we learn in the outbreak that happened in the United States? Well, we can't ever take anything for granted. And, multiple months of a deadly outbreak of a disease in another continent apparently is not enough warning for us to be prepared. And we had assurances that it was going to do. I was on network TV saying, hey, we're ready. Let it, we're going to get it here. It's going to come, and we're going to be ready for it. Wrong. Completely dead wrong. And so it's very, very important that these lessons that we learned, these very important lessons that we learned, they didn't really have any traction at all. And so we were really lucky that Ebola wasn't the kind of a disease that would spread easily because it's not airborne. And certainly this little cartoon talks about we were just daggum lucky that it didn't go. And we can talk about the pandemic influenza. If you want to look at it in 1918, I think one of the important things, there was about a 30% incidence in the world. So about 3 out of 10 people were infected, and it may have killed as many as 25 million people in 25 weeks. And some estimates are that there were 150 million people killed, and there are many factors that would make a pandemic flu outbreak really, really serious. So what's the plan for us now? Every healthcare facility in the U.S. should be ready to respond, and obviously we found out that that wasn't the case. And the chances are it's not going to happen if you're living in a hospital or if you work in a hospital, but today could be the day. And that still goes for us. So where do we need to invest? We have to have research facilities, and I'm going to show you a picture of the NBAF that we have here in Manhattan in a few minutes. And we have to have places that can care for critical care patients. We have to have people in hospitals. We have to think through what they're going to do if they were to happen to have an Ebola patient or some other very significant disease walk through their door. And of course, our first responders have to be prepared, and they have to understand PPE, and they have to have it. On board. This is the NBAF that we have here in Manhattan, and this is an example of what it is that we're doing within the United States to try to keep up with this. So. Paul Epstein at Harvard has said, never has the divide between animal and man been so porous or so dangerous. And things like global travel, overpopulation, urbanization, and climate change are speeding the spread of diseases from animal to man. And we're in the midst of a surge of diseases that we thought were completely conquered. And if we think back to what Surgeon General Stewart said, these things are all factoring into the fact that we're not prepared. And this is just a tiny list of diseases that have become important since the Surgeon General, made his infamous statement. So, and when you overlay these diseases that have occurred with the fact that there are people out there who say they want to do it on purpose and have told us that they will do it if they can figure it out, that's a very, very daunting challenge for us. So we don't really know when we're going to have a disease outbreak, and we have to be prepared to deal with that. And with that, I will close, and thank you very much to the organizers of this event.